Well, a very warm welcome from me, first of all, Monica Bohm-Duchen, the director of the Insiders Outsiders project, which, as many of you will, I hope by now, know was a festival, first of all, a face-to-face festival designed to pay tribute to the hugely rich and diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi Europe to this country's culture, and it's had an unexpectedly rich afterlife in the form of online events such as these, very much an ongoing concern. I'm going to keep the introductions fairly brief because we've got lots of wonderfully rich material to get through tonight. So let me just start first of all by introducing Norbert Mein, who is the music expert. I'm certainly not. Norbert is he's actually born in Weimar in East Germany, but been based in this country since the late 1990s, a freelance singer, but mostly associated with the Royal College of Music, a language coach, a vocal coach, and project curator. But now, as I say, mostly focusing not just on his teaching at the RCM, but also for our purposes, most relevantly on, well, what started off as a wonderfully named project, singing a song in a foreign land, as the name suggests, researching the lives and careers of the émigré composers and musicians who made it to these shores, and also the creation of a wonderful, small and ever-changing chamber group, mostly comprising students, am I right, Norbert, at the Royal College called Ensemble Émigré, dedicated to playing that music. He's now the principal investigator of the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project with the slightly more prosaic title of Music, Migration and Mobility, doing absolutely wonderful things in the process. After Norbert, who will say some words of introduction to this event, we'll be handing over to Amanda Hopkinson, a photo historian of great repute, also an expert on literary translation at the University of East Anglia. For our purposes today, most pertinently, the daughter of Gerti Deutsch, but she will also be talking about Lotte Meitner-Graf, who was a close friend, I think I'm right, aren't I, Amanda, of your mother. She will talk first about Lotte as the elder stateswoman, if you like, and then move over to her mother, Gerti. We'll then be handing over to Julian Mayer, who is a picture researcher, formerly worked at Getty Images, and very much the expert on the Czech-born photographer Erich Auerbach. And the last, but certainly not least, to Julia Crockatt, who is a former or retired cellist and cello teacher, now a very keen photographer. And once more, most importantly for tonight, she is the granddaughter of Laelia Goehr and comes from a very, very distinguished musical family, as you will hear, as perhaps you already know. Good. So if I could just repeat my request that you all stay muted, whether you want to remain visible or not is up to you. We are recording the event, so just do bear that in mind. There will, of course, be a chance for a Q&A afterwards. If you wouldn't mind addressing the questions in the chat to me, to Monica Bohm-Duchen, so nobody else is distracted while they're talking. So I think without further ado, over to you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Monica. Now, I want to start off, good evening, everybody, and all over the world, I hope, wherever you are. Here it's a lovely Sunday evening in London. I would like to first of all start by introducing the Music Migration Mobility Project a little bit. And our main output for the general public, I would say, will be an online resource. And I hope, Monica, you will be happy to hear that the title Singing a Song in a Foreign Land will be retained for this online resource. And I will just show you, we've actually just relaunched the entire pages on the Royal College of Music website, and we'll be showing them to you in a moment. Now, when Monica asked me if I wanted to join this event about émigré photographers and music, I was very happy to be asked, because I thought I could, kill several birds with one stone here and find lots of photos of the émigré musicians that we have been researching. And, I even thought we might be able to use them for this online resource, which I will now show you briefly. This is a project. We've been doing research in this area at the Royal College, or I've been doing research in this area since about 2012. And the current AHRC funded project actually brings together a team of musicologists and practical musicians like myself, but also geographers who are going to make maps of people's movement. And I will be talking a bit more about this. So Singing a Song in a Foreign Land, and that will stay the permanent online resource that we're building on the Royal College of Music, is dedicated to the legacy of migrant musicians from Nazi Europe in Britain. and it provides this online resource provides a list of featured musicians. It provides a growing amount of featured works with recordings and details about pieces of music. It provides in-depth stories and a growing number of oral history interviews that you can watch online. So this is the main structure of the online resource. And I just will dive into the featured musicians side here so that you can get an idea of the sort of range of musicians that we are exploring. And it's loading a bit slowly. So the lady here is, you can see, is Jarodine Frank, who was a German language coach in London, and she came to Britain just at the very beginning of the Kindertransport, and she had to fend for herself for a large time, part of the period during the war in Britain, and then became one of the leading, if not the leading, language coach and expert on German diction in this country. These featured musicians, you can browse them here, so you can see the Amadeus Quartet, and we will actually see some photographs of them today. There is and individual members, but Karl Ebert, the opera director, we will see pictures of him. But there are also composers such as Hans Gahl, who was really greatly established in Germany as the director of the Mainz Conservatoire and also as an opera composer and symphonic composer as well. And he lived most of his life in Edinburgh and created more than half of his oeuvre in Britain. Roberto Gerard, we may see some images of him. He was a originally Swiss musician or with Swiss and Alsatian family roots, who grew up in Catalonia and then had to emigrate from there because he was a Republican, and he made a home in Cambridge and was very influential in British music in the 1950s and onwards. Walter Goehr, obviously the grandfather of two ladies in this very meeting, who was a very influential conductor and actually came to Britain before the Nazis came to power, and he was headhunted by the Columbia Recording Company in Britain, and he conducted many recordings in this country, but also played an important part at Morley College. And I mean, it's a very, very influential figure in this period. Bertolt Goldschmidt, another important composer, who actually regained some fame in the 1980s and 90s, and was then also widely played for quite a while in Britain and in Germany. Then I will have to leave some people out here, but Hans Keller, a famous broadcaster and husband of Milan Kosman, an artist who made drawings of many musicians, actually very similar subjects to the ones we will see this evening in the photographs. So then there are others like Karl Rankel, who was the director of the Royal Opera House in the 1940s until 51. There's Franz Weitzenstein, who was a young composer then and studied at the Royal College of Music. Max Rostal, the violinist who taught most of the members of the Amadeus Quartet during the Second World War and helped them to get off the ground. Matthias Scheiber, a very influential, originally Hungarian Émigré musician who wrote film music, but also fascinating serious music. And then the list goes on. So there are many short biographies that you can explore here. And so when I heard about this event, then I thought I could find lots of photographs of these people, and was I muted for a moment? I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. So the emigres that we are going to, that the photographs of these emigre photographers really show the stars of the time. and the Émigré musicians that we have been researching were probably mostly not in the very front row of the star system. So there are other considerations here that make it very fitting that I'm involved here today. And I think that, first of all, I want to point out that these musicians were actually trained musicians, these photographers were trained musicians themselves. Gerti Deutsch trained at the Musikakademie in Vienna with the composer Franz Schmidt, amongst others, and wanted to be a concert pianist. And it was just prevented by a problem with her right arm. And but she also in London, she knew the artists Milan Kosman and Hans Keller, for example. So she was very connected with that musician community in Britain. Erich Auerbach learned the piano and the violin from an early age and studied at the Prague University Collegium Musicum. He didn't complete his degree, but he was also professionally involved in classical music. He worked as a music critic for the Prager Tageblatt. Laelia Goehr, and do please, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that name, she was the wife of the conductor Walter Goehr, and she was a pianist, and she left Berlin in 1932, and she performed professionally as part of a duo of jazz pianists, the Stone Sisters. And when her husband Walter Goehr wrote film music, Laelia would often write the tunes, so she was also professionally involved in music. Now, Amanda will say if Lotte Meitner-Graf, if we can find something similar in her biography, but certainly they were close to many Émigré musicians because they shared their passion for music. What I would like to also ask us to see when we look at these photographs, if that passion for music and the values that these composers held and that made music particularly important in their lives, if we can actually see that in the way these photographs are presented, in the way they've portrayed their subjects. Please do with the Music Migration and Mobility Project, and not unlike the Insiders Outsiders Festival, we've been grappling with the legacy of nationalist narratives and identity politics that have tended to exclude and marginalize migrants. And we continue to have these problems today, of course. On the other hand, being an outsider can also have its advantages. And I think this may be especially true for someone who is an onlooker like a photographer. So this is also something I want us to keep in mind when we watch these images tonight. And Milan Kosman, I think, is also a very good example of that. Somebody who was just a little bit outside everything and was able to then have a very clear view on the subjects she drew. And like pictures by Erich Auerbach, we also have many works by Milan Kosman in the collections at the Royal College of Music. I also want to point out one word in the project title that Monica has mentioned, music migration and mobility. Mobility, which is perhaps the most ambivalent word here, and also many people connect with different things. But for us, we have found that thinking of mobility rather than of where people belong or where they may be rooted can actually really change our gaze when we look at the stories of migrants. And we're working with this small team of geographers to look at which countries these people have traveled to and how their mobility, their journeys are reflected in their work. And it was the professor of humanities at Harvard University, Stephen Greenblatt, who coined the term cultural mobility. And that comes to mind very frequently. And I think we should keep that in mind tonight when we watch these images. So let us think of the transfer of cultural knowledge, of skills, of performance traditions, of knowledge of repertoire, and of a particular way of relating to music, really, that occurred during this period. And I will just give very few examples here of very mobile musicians we will see. Yehudi Menuhin, for example, he was photographed, I think, by all the photographers we're seeing tonight, was the son of Lithuanian Jews, grew up in America, but also worked as a child prodigy already in Germany long before the Second World War, and studied, amongst others, with Adolf Busch, and brought that tradition of violin playing, or soaked that up everywhere. And then he traveled. He was in Britain, and then he traveled to Germany with Benjamin Britten in 1945, and played in Bergen-Belsen very famously, and also played again with Furtwängler in 1947, connecting those worlds that had drifted apart so much during the Second World War. So Gertie Deutsch's work also connects the pre-World War II Salzburg Festival with the Glyndebourne Festival in Britain, and also, the Glyndebourne Festival had been called the British Salzburg in the press, and then Rudolf Bing, who set up Glyndebourne, or helped to set up Glyndebourne, then helped to set up the Edinburgh Festival. And my colleague Niels Grosch from Salzburg University points out that this is actually the mobility of a festival concept, of a whole way of celebrating music. And Karl Ebert, the director, who was very active at Glyndebourne, photographed many times here, very charismatic figure. He brought his whole way of directing opera as a Gesamtkunstwerk to Britain, and really infused the British opera scene with a level of achievement, also of aspiration in bringing direction and music together that perhaps was not there previously so much. I could go on with this list, but I think we should start looking at actual photographs. But I want to also point out that there are other foreign musicians, like, for example, Elisabeth Schwarzkopf or Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, who were photographed by these émigrés. And again, they came from Germany. Walter Legg, the famous record producer for EMI, brought these people over. And again, they represented something of a togetherness between German and British music. Then there were the Russian émigrés, sometimes via America, like, of course, Stravinsky was celebrated in these photographs, and we will see some of him today. If you imagine the mobility in Stravinsky's life from Russia to Paris, and then in the US, then traveling also to Britain after the war, or Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist of whom we will see images. So we will also see images of Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears and Michael Tippett, and those were British musicians who were very close to those émigrés and also close to the international scene that came with them. For example, Mislav Rostropovich, as a Soviet exile. So my point really is that the musical world, which was documented by these photographers, was an international one, a world that certainly after all the displacements and forced mobilities of the war had suddenly become much smaller, a world in which German, British, American, Russian, Polish, Jewish and non-Jewish musicians came together in pursuit of excellence and an almost spiritual devotion to something that belonged to all humanity, something that was in stark contrast to the darkness they had all seen and experienced between 1939 and 45. So the music in this way represented a positive, almost utopian vision of the future. And it's very timely to reflect on this internationalism. We are coming out of a pandemic now, and we realize that Brexit has made it a lot harder for British musicians, certainly, to pursue an international career. And sometimes we really do not appreciate the value of what we have until we lose it. And looking at these photographs makes me want to fight to secure the international mobility of music and the arts in general for future generations. So I will now pass on to Amanda Hopkinson. Please, Amanda, it's all yours.
Amanda, you need the same leitmotif. You need to unmute yourself. Amanda. Thank you very much, Norbert. That was a lovely and most apposite introduction.
We're all doing it. Apologies.
There we are. Let me do
go
ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's good to also heard Norbert introduce some of the subjects that I'm sure the rest of us will be discussing. And we can rely on you if we ever forget who's with who on the way through. I'll also apologize a little bit in advance that the two photographers I'm looking at, I've actually cheated. And I've taken excerpts from, first Lotte Meitner-Graf is from a long feature I've written for the History of Photography magazine, and Gerti is from a book on the period, and sort of amended them. So you might have to put up with a few little jumps from place to place as I'm trying to pull out of the themes, went with the originals and focus on the themes of, that we're discussing today. So briefly, a bit of context. Lotte was born Charlotte Graf on the 17th of November, 1899 to lawyer Wilhelm Graf and his wife Bertha. Her father was among the first Jewish lawyers to qualify and practice in Austria, but both her grandfathers were Czech. And this is something, a theme that Norbert has already touched on, that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a constantly moving feast where people came and went from different capitals as they attracted a different kind of creative clientele. Lotte was the eldest of three sisters, whose upbringing was bourgeois and conventional, allowing sufficient funds to advance her a portion of her inheritance when she decided to pursue her studies beyond school. The Grafs owned a comfortable apartment in the capital and a cottage in the country. At home, emphasis was placed on learning and culture, particularly in the arts. In the capital were Jews and Christians, Catholic and Lutheran or Evangelisch, coexisted without notable fuss. The Grafs maintained few religious practices and appeared, as was prevalent, to have considered themselves assimilated Austrians. Big mistake. At the age of 16, Lotte went directly from school onto the 5-year diploma in photography at the now legendary Grafische Lehr- und Versuchsanstalt, approximating a college of graphic research and design, as yet still not really in existence anywhere much, graphic design being a very new kind of concept, both in architecture and in the arts. Just very briefly, because it matters, founded in 1888, the Anstalt, as it's commonly referred to, was progressive in admitting women in 1908. Outstanding in its field of combining applied arts with communication, it was assisted by new inventions in both cameras and printing techniques, bringing photography and graphics into a combined practice. During the mass conscription of males in the First World War, the Anstalt opened its door to 718 women students. And that transformed, in a way, the photographic milieu in Vienna, because what did these women students do when they graduated? They went forth and applied themselves to doing apprenticeships and photo studios, and a great many of them to opening their own. That is, in fact, what Lotte did, opening hers in 1924 and on Wolfseiler Straße, which is a desirable address in the city center. And she operated there with two assistants, one of whom became Lisette Model and went to the United States and became extremely well known as a photographer there. In 1926, Lotte married an industrial chemist named Walter Meitner, actually the brother of the more famous nuclear physicist Lise Meitner, and she escaped eventually to Sweden, as the other Meitners, the ones we're talking about, moved to London. With the marriage came a musical family, including the pianist Rudolf Serkin, Walter's cousin, and violinist Adolf Busch, Serkin's father-in-law, founder and leader of the Busch String Quartet. Lotte's love of music was immense, and her small, elegant figure, dressed in black and slightly stooped in her later years, became a familiar sight at concerts in the Wigmore and Royal Festival halls. We used to meet with her there regularly when she didn't come and visit the house where we lived in Hampstead. Now, a skip. What was also happening musically was that there was a growth in interest in international music festivals, and Salzburg, the Festspiel, which was founded between 1920 and 22, was one of the earliest and certainly the most famous in the region. The cast list of those involved in its establishment involved director Max Reinhardt, poet and dramatist Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and composer Richard Strauss, matched in prestige by international performance. A notable attraction was Marion Anderson, a black contralto from the United States, whose repertoire extended from opera to spirituals and freedom songs. She was the one whom the Daughters of the Revolution, I think everybody knows who they are, succeeded in having banned from singing publicly because she was African American, and even prevented her from singing in children's high schools black children's high schools because she was black. Luckily, she happened to have or get Eleanor Roosevelt on side, and she helped her to move the concert from Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall to the Lincoln Memorial Hall, where she performed outside. There was such a huge crowd of 75,000 people who came to hear her. And at the end, instead of singing the national anthem or the Stars and Stripes, she sang Freedom Song. So this was sort of very, you know, mixing already what we'll see with some of the other composers, jazz, modern, and classical music together. She was photographed, this is Marion Anderson, at the 1935 festival by Gerti Deutsch and Trude Fleischmann, among other women photographers, and of course, as we'll see, by Lotte. A number of Lotte's star sitters would reappear as London Émigré or as visitors to our home, rephotographed at later stages in their prominent careers. Throughout Lotte's career as a studio photographer, she took multiple portraits of some 152 musicians, including singers, composers, and conductors, and 235 sitters in all other groups combined, including subgroups of scientists, artists, writers, and publishers. She was very much involved with the arts. She took over 30 long-playing record covers and provided all the musical images for a 73-page City in London Festival program for 1964, and all the images for Anthony Hopkins' autobiography, Music All Around Me. I mean, she worked immensely hard, and she used every outlet available to her. Let's get to that part. The drama of her departing Vienna and coming to London will have to wait, but she finally found, after a period working for a Hungarian photographer called Fire, who, F-A-Y-E-R, who, like a great many people in London at that time, was terrified that Hitler was going to extend his invasions to Britain in 1941. And Fire disappeared to the United States. Lotte stayed behind and decided to open her own studio. And it was in what is now Stella McCartney's boutique on Old Bond Street. It was on the 5th and top floor of a Victorian house. The lift, operated by a plump lady named Doris, only reached the 4th, and customers were expected to climb the final flight of stairs. Special arrangements had to be made for Lotte's most essential item of studio furniture, a Bechstein baby grand. It came up via service lift, arrived at next door's rooftop loggia, then to be deposited in Lotte's attic. The task required 6 men. The piano preserved its prescribed function whenever a pianist attended to have their portrait made, and the hands of Alfred Brendel, Arthur Rubinstein, and Anthony Hopkins, among others, were photographed at its keyboard. Lotte's assistant, Linda Sullivan, recollects the staff stopping work to listen to Rubinstein perform an impromptu concert. Musicians were invited to attend any sittings, bringing whatever smaller instruments they could, together with concert hall outfits. A word about her style. Her allegiance was to the black and white studio portrait throughout her life, reproduced as large as possible for the purpose of increasing detail and definition, meticulously retouched to remove any imperfection and enhance contrastive lighting, and frequently focused as much on the subject's hands as their face. In her relatively rare outdoor images, her control of natural light and rigorous composition is paramount. She composed an image of a tree with as much respect for its geometry as she would a building. But it was people that she was really interested in, and it's extraordinary that she managed to persist with what became as dated a medium as studio portraiture, taken with a very old-fashioned camera. She finally moved from sort of plate glass box effort to a Hasselblad or a Rolleiflex, but they were still early editions of those. And she remained true to her form and perfected it really over her lifetime. So let's sort of look at some of her pictures now, Frimé Moni. And I think just about all of them. It might be just Gertie's, but I think hers too actually have captions giving us the names. This, yeah, we've got to go back to Lotte.
Okay. Right, shall I?
Okay. I think it's probably easy if we scroll slowly through, and if I sort of interrupt you, so obviously I've got something to say. But this again is a very traditional focus with the lighting very carefully arranged on the faces and the rest kind of blending out. But you get the sense of contrast all the way through. And as another of her assistants once said, Lotte really didn't like anything that was in between. She loved contrast. And most of all, she hated dusk. So she had very powerful lighting, got exactly what she wanted, where she wanted it. Okay, that's Stravinsky. And funnily enough, we were talking about Milan Kosman earlier, who almost made a lifetime's work of drawing. She was a sketcher, Stravinsky. And this could have come straight out of, well, I've got a calendar here, but I don't have time to look it up, straight from one of her pictures in the Stravinsky calendar. Okay. Klempera, she couldn't resist the hands even when they weren't on a keyboard. And I've been trying to work out which score this is. Norbert will probably be able to tell us at some point. But yeah, it's obviously very classical, could even be Mozart. And yes, he was a wonderful conductor. So that was important. Rostropovich, who again we'll see later, again we get the hands, again we get the fantastic shape and texture of the instrument, where you can feel the wood really, almost as he does. Kathleen Ferrier, in a dreamy mood. We'll get some of her performing in a bit, but and Susie Jeans, looking back the other way, who was an organist and also was Austrian originally, and she actually went to music school with my mum. They were great friends, and her surname is because she married Sir James Jean, the great astronomer. And this is, you know, to die for. He's just sort of canoodling with the piano, really, isn't he? The way he leans over it and is completely and utterly absorbed in the keyboard. And here's Arthur Rubinstein, who we talked about briefly before, playing with his eyes shut. Obviously no score, everything by heart. And she's put all the focus on his hands and his face again, that lovely froth of white hair. Yes, then we come to Jacqueline Duque, who I think all our photographers have photographed. And again, the focus not on the photographer. She doesn't take subjects looking into camera if she can avoid it. But yes, much more characteristically looking at something beyond the frame. This is Marion Anderson, who you'll see again in one of Gertie's, taken very differently. But you can see, I think, the very level way in which she's looking, that this woman has chutzpah. She's, you know, it was Julia Margaret Cameron who said that you, as a portraitist, our great Victorian portrait photographer, what you want to do is elicit, she did say, the inner man from the outer features, but you know what she means. You do feel you know something about Marion Anderson from looking at this. Okay. And this one just slipped in. I have to thank Tony, sorry, see you a moment. So Barrett for providing all the photographs from the Lotte Meitner-Graf archive. And he slipped this one in, and it looks unusual because he's not a musician, of course. But what is interesting is that his mother was Leonie Hock, a Czech musician of considerable standing, who was my mother's music teacher. And then Ernst's wife, Ilse, became my music teacher then when I used to walk across the heath every Saturday morning from our home in the Vale of Health to theirs in Brightdale Gardens for my lessons. And whenever Ilse was strict with me, and she did have a metal ruler, he would be on the way out and would have always a wonderful book for me to borrow and to study. And he even gave me my copy of Dürer. So no, a wonderful man, and just typical of this very cosmopolitan, cross-cultural atmosphere that we're talking about at that time. And here's Menuhin. I think nobody seems to be sure. Tony certainly couldn't say where this rehearsal was, but I'm pretty sure it's the Royal Festival Hall. So this will be early 50s. And I think he's part conducting with his bow. And this one is another in the style of Ashkenazi, isn't it? Very intense young man. And that here, unusually, there is the eye contact, which is why it's so striking. And this is his sister, Hepzibah, with whom he sometimes performed. Okay, also in the same rehearsal. And then here's a worksheet, so you actually see what she was doing and which ones she was pulling to focus on and to blow up then. And this one, because I couldn't resist it. And they're just miming playing the cello, obviously. But it's interesting that Marcel Marceau himself, which is a little known fact, was also from his early days as a lycéen schoolboy in the French Resistance. So there is a connection also across boundaries through Europe. Okay. Now we're with Gerti.
Amanda, would you like me to stop screen sharing, or do you want to go straight into your mum's images?
I'll say a little bit about her, a short bit about her.
Shall I stop sharing then for a minute? Yes.
Okay, yes. Gerti's education was somewhat haphazard, but music accompanied her all the way. Raised whatever the Austrian version of Edwardian style is, she was home educated by a French governess who took her to Sunday Mass, preferably one by a local composer, say Mozart or Schubert. She was proficient on both violin and piano, which she was taught by concert performer Leonie Hock, who of course in turn was taught by Bruckner and knew Brahms and that whole world again, and was regularly commandeered to perform to invited guests at home, something for which she never really forgave her own mother. All this altered when she was sent off to a girls' boarding school in Bushey, just north of London, aged 15. During the brief years she spent there before being expelled, she kept a diary, recording the impromptu concerts she performed and her attempts to teach her friends to sing Lieder to her accompaniment. I think they're probably about as successful as they were with teaching me to sing Lieder to her accompaniment. But she managed to sort of make, music being the famous international wordless language, to make very good friends, and they would get her to play for them, even if it was just fooling around on the piano. Back in Vienna, and after another adventurous interlude, this time in Paris, she applied to attend the Académie für Musik, aged 19. The customary course of study lasted 6 years, but she was admitted immediately into level 5. She thus completed her degree within 2 years, focusing on her piano work and attaining the highest first given in 1930. She studied under the composer, pianist, and cellist Franz Schmidt, of whom we shall see a portrait, and perhaps more surprisingly, under Grete Wiesenstahl, who we shall also be seeing, something called rhythmische Gymnastik, which I can't translate other than as rhythmical gymnastics. Partly perhaps through Schmidt, Gerti became very interested in contemporary classical music, Schoenberg, Richard Strauss, and Alban Berg in Austria, in the end segued into Bliss, Britten, and Walton in England as subjects for her camera. They informed her playing at the time, for the Blüthner Concert Grand accompanied her to England when she moved here in 1936, as did an extended circle of musicians in exile from the Familia from Vienna. A concert pianist's career beckoned with successful initial European concerts and the possibility of travel to the United States. But an unexpected diagnosis of neuritis in her right arm cut short her plans, obliging her to abandon playing the piano, except as an amateur. Determined to become a professional in life and not a dilettante, she took the difficult decision to retrain in photography. Lotte Meitner-Graf may have influenced her decision to attend the Grafische Lernversuchsanstalt from 1933 to 4. Okay, it was, I mean, the new musical influences were also reflected, of course, in the artistic ones. And I don't think there's a photographer that came out of the Anstalt without some sort of grounding in Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, or the whole Bauhaus world. By 1935, Gertie was immersed in the Salzburg Festival, shooting gemütlich or cozy pictures of Irmgard Seyfried and Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Schumann alongside stars of the rapidly internationalizing festival world. As the reverse of one print puts it, she had to caption her own prints, which she did in haste and not always in the best English. Austria's city of dramatic beauty is echoing with many languages, both on its stages and among its audiences. In 1936, Gertie returned to England as a freelance photographer. Her first exhibition attracted attention, and she soon began regularly supplying the pages of Weekly Illustrated and Lilliput, both magazines edited by the Hungarian exile, Stefan Laurent. Using the successful model of the two German illustrated weekly magazines he had founded, the Berliner and München Illustrated, Laurent then launched Picture Post in October 1938. It was the same month in which Gertie married its deputy editor, from 1940, its editor, Tom Hopkinson. Gertie was the magazine's first woman photographer and only woman staffer. Although she rapidly adapted to its reportage styles, big division between her, or diversion between her and Lotte here, because Lotte stayed true to her style and form to the end, and Gertie adapted. For the next dozen years, that's until the 50s, she regularly specialized in cultural, especially musical features. In one sense, she simply shifted from the Salzburg to the Glyndebourne Festival. So the images we're looking at this evening show both a little of her earlier portraits and her later story-led photojournalism. I'm grateful to both Gott and Brigitte Keindl of the Photo Archive, which houses her independent collection, and to Mel Llewellyn and Poppy Pollitt of the Tom Hopkinson Archive at Getty Images for supplying what I shall now show you, or rather, Moni shall. So many thanks also to Moni for also helping me to sequence these images and I'm showing them. So we now need to go down to Gertie, which is, and see some of her freelance one. Yes, Trude Fleischmann also worked in a photo studio around Bond Street in London. There was a whole collection of Viennese photographers and one or two Hungarians and Czechs. And Trude Fleischmann came there, but then moved on to New York, where she also, like Lisette Model, became very famous. So Severin Eisenberger was another friend again of Gertie's. She brought these friendships over here with her. I think it's interesting, you can sell the original images. This is a vintage print because they've got this lovely sepia context to it. The more recent ones don't. And also because she's actually put at the bottom her signature, him, pianist, and her signature, Getty Deutsch of Vienna. And she kept that for a long while. That seemed to be a sort of selling point. It was on her business card as well. Okay. Again, I won't describe each of the, I've actually got a section on each of these musicians, but it's going to take far too long. So we'll keep scrolling through again. And this is the Franz Schmidt that we were talking about earlier, the composer. And this is Der Gombrich, this incredibly talented family. I can't remember, I think it was Amadea Leonie, she was her real name, but everybody called her Dea. And she was Gombrich's sister, much beloved. And these are her hands, which again, it's so important if you're photographing musicians to not just look at her face, but at her hands. So yes. And here's hers and Marion Anderson in a much more relaxed moment. I don't know if they went for a beer together or not, but she would have been the only colored woman or woman of color in that context. And she looks completely at ease and interested in her surroundings. Okay. And this is Grete Wiesenthal, who taught Gertie rhythmic, whatever they were. movements. And here she is, the choreographer, as you see, which was her later career. And I just think that's a fantastic, to some extent it's a grab shot, but just the right movements. You get a real sense of her in her place at that time. And here's, yes, this is the Italian from Pisa, baritone, Eugenio Fernandi, with Schwarzkopf, very much sort of Dirndl-fied. It was not uncommon, but it's all very much in keeping with this kind of wedding cake look of Salzburg. And this one, very different. He's conducting at this point, and Gertie's chosen to take him for almost sort of from underneath at this angle with this very dramatic lighting. I wanted to show a whole sequence, but again, it would have taken too long. But this one, you can see he's again kind of transported a bit like that one of Arthur Rubinstein playing with his eyes shut. And this is Gertie's equivalent of grab shot, but even so, she can't help, I think, but get a good picture. And he was attending the festival. And he was also very much on the side of the angels as things became worse and worse. In Austria, he chose to lose his post as director of musicals in Dresden and eventually make his way to the United States. He was not Jewish, he wasn't bound to leave, but he refused to perform for the Nazis. And here's Karl Anton Ebert, who I think Norbert already introduced to us, and he's rehearsing. I think it's from the Rijksprogress, but we'll see in a minute because there's one or two more of him. And that's Fritz Busch's son. And Ebert and Busch were two founders of the Glyndebourne Festival together. He was the musical director, and Hans-Peter Busch was his son, who he was kind of bringing on to look at the score with him. And here, this is, yes, again, having fun, but actually in the wrong order. Of course, this is W.H. Auden, and who wrote the libretto, and Henze, the composer, and Chester Kallman, the producer. And all I really remember about Auden was afterwards him getting very cross with Gertie because he asked to have a number of prints made for him, which of course she did. And he said, "Why have you retouched out all my wrinkles? It took me a lifetime to get them all." So here's them being informal. And more informality, we were on holiday in Bad Gastein, I think it was. And this is Louis Kentner, Menuhin's accompanist, and they're both rehearsing together in sort of gear we're probably all ourselves wearing today. And the next one, he was a great yoga fanatic and believed in exercise and meditation and so on. And he's now introducing his son to it as well. Of a morning, a perfect headstands, looking very relaxed. And there's a little local girl who's not quite making it. And here again, Susie Jeans, who was her friend from Vienna and who used to spend Christmas regularly with her husband, James Jeans, down in Box Hill in Surrey. And Matej Seiber, who Norbert also talked about. And they're working together on a keyboard. Okay, so now this is just very quickly, you can see some of the rest of the sequence with the conducting going on, but also see that she used up her film doing commercial work, photographing people's children, usually in my nursery or bedroom at home, much to my chagrin. So here we go. This is the Glyndebourne, obviously. Well, it actually has the information here, so I think we can scroll through slowly and you can read as we go. Yeah, this is one that I particularly like for its use of shadows. And yes, Frederick Ashton, who at this stage in his career was actually more a dancer, a ballet dancer, than he was a choreographer. And yes, Priestley was, of course, a founder of the 1941 committee, a sort of liberal left program for what Britain will do when it comes out of the war, that in the end sort of segued in with the Beveridge Report on creating a new Britain. But Tom Hopkinson, my father, was on the same committee with him, and they worked together quite a lot. So a lot of these connections sort of went both ways. They were journalistic as well as musical, as well as photographic. And this was from the tragedy that actually looks more humorous than Albert Herring, the comedy does. And these are pictures of, there's a couple of them, of Kathleen Ferrier and her maidens, which was the sort of thing that Picture Post loved doing. It was all about making high art into popular culture and finding the bridge to do it. And so these ridiculous wigs and hats, perhaps attracted people's attention to read on more about Benjamin Britten than they would have otherwise done. And yes, yeah, this was, sorry, we've got the Albert Herring separated, but this, it's interesting, this one. It could have come from Die Laterne. There was a German language theatre off the Finchley Road called The Lantern. And Gertie shot a story for Picture Post of Schweik, the good soldier Schweik. And the same sort of style, the same sort of imagery, the same sort of poses feature in both these two very different sort of outlets, even though the pictures all come from about the 1940s. And here's Ada Schnabel again. And what's lovely is that they've got this quartet, and they're all completely different nationalities, and they're all kind of coming together at this international festival. May we again see one. And yes, Bruno Walter was one of Gertie's great sort of heroes. They knew each other quite well, and she's taken a lot of photographs of him. And Elisabeth Schumann was also passing through Britain in the 40s before moving to the United States. This is probably a visit from her, but she was not Jewish, but her husband was, and so she had to leave. Okay. And from memory, I'd say this is Jacqueline Duque when she came to our house when she was about 16 with her parents. And for some reason, everybody ended up speaking French. I mean, I know they came from the Channel Islands, but obviously they spoke perfect English. But I just remember this very sort of amusing encounter all in French stopped when suddenly, you know, Getty said, well, are you going to play? Am I going to actually photograph you? And she just said, yes, bah, and sat down and played. And again, the shadow. And this one is, again, for all these were for Picture Post, but that's the sort of thing, again, the Picture Post would like. And he was Italian, but he was born in the wrong place, in Istria, which, you know, this endless toing and froing, what was and wasn't the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his father was first suspected of Italian nationalist leanings, and then Dalla Piccola acquired a Jewish wife. And so basically he had one hell of a war, but he still managed to use Schoenberg, Berg, Busoni as sort of feeds into his own music. And though his compositions are much less known now, I think, than they deserve to be, I think the most timeless are the opera Prigioniero, is the prisoner, which was written in direct opposition to fascism after the war in 1950. And then its sort of counterpart, the Canti di Liberazione, Songs of Freedom, which he composed in 1955. And I think that's that was a good place to stop, but I couldn't resist putting another hat in at the end. We had a hat in with Severin Eisenberg at the beginning, and so we added, with Monica's help, Fritz Busch at the end, because I just think that's such a wonderful portrait of anyone, and because Fritz Busch was so important at that time.
He was. Thank you so much, Amanda. I know this is so much, and of course you went through two different photographers' lives and work here. So I really want to thank you for that. I'm sure there's lots we could talk about right now, but I think we should move on straight away to Leon Mayer. Leon, would you like me to start sharing your PowerPoint?
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Thank you. Okay, good evening. It's been a remarkable tapestry of pictures so far, and there's things will develop, I hope, that we'll see some of the same names and same faces, but by different eyes, so to speak. Unlike my colleague this evening, I don't have a family relationship with the photographer Erich Auerbach, nor regrettably did I ever meet him. I curated his archive after it was acquired from the family by Houghton Getty in the early 1990s, where I was employed, and we produced a large format book for the German publishers Koenemann Verlag in 1996 entitled Images of Music. Auerbach had a very long career, about over 4 decades, specializing in music, and this selection can only give a glimpse of his vast output. As Norbert said at the introduction, I've tried to choose photos that give an emphasis to the themes of musicians who were refugees and émigrés, and to stimulate links to the music migration mobility project. Erich Auerbach was educated, as Norbert has already said, in Prague in music. He was born in December 1911 in the German-speaking Falkenau, which was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which is now Sokolov in the Czech Republic. And he studied at the University Collegium in Prague. To help finance his studies, he took part-time work as a music critic with the Prager Tagblatt, which gave him the entry to take photographs. His first camera was a present from his doctor father, presumably a Leica. However, he did not complete his music degree, much to his father's disappointment. If we can move on, Prague was an important musical scene at the time, and amongst the photos surviving from these years are the pianist Margaret Long with Maurice Ravel and George Schell, Huberman, and conductors. He was very, very fond of conductors. And can we just scroll? Sorry, Norbert. Thank you for facilitating this. Can we just scroll slowly? Okay. He recorded. He took his first recording session in April 1937, which was Pablo Casals' The Dvorak Cello Concerto, which was recorded especially after Casals had traveled from Barcelona, and the cellist smoked through the whole recording session, maybe not the whole 3 days, but it was Auerbach's first recording session, and the recording in 21 takes on 78 became legendary and is still available. Auerbach had a great fondness for conductors, and this photo I don't think he actually took, but it was in his collection where it was a favorite of his. It's taken in Berlin in reception for Toscanini in 1929. Only Furtwängler, it's a sort of pantheon of the greats really of that time. Only Furtwängler would remain in Germany. We have Bruno Walter, Mengelberg, and Erich Kleiber, and Fritz Busch, who've already been mentioned and would come and perform after the war in London. And just in passing, we have Alphonse Mukher, the famous Czech artist. If we can pause here a minute. So just pause a minute. Sorry. Auerbach left Czechoslovakia in July 1939. The country had already been invaded in March of that year, and he took along with him only his most precious negatives. Although his work was published, his early archive was lost. Crossing the border to Poland, and thanks to his journalism contacts, he was able to find passage to England, and he described himself as having arrived in England as penniless. We don't know what happened to his family, but his brother also made it to England. In London, he worked as official photographer of the Czech government in exile and received a commendation from the future Prime Minister Masaryk. Afterwards, from 1945, he became staff photographer on the magazine Illustrated, and after the magazine's closure in 1957, he devoted full-time freelancing and his love for music. We can continue, please. Erich Auerbach, cited as his artistic mentor, the great and nowadays somewhat underrated German Jewish photographer namesake, Erich Salomon. He dedicated his 1971 book, An Eye for Music, to Dr. Erich Salomon, the photographer who has not to this day been surpassed. He perished in Auschwitz, who taught me, though we never met. Much has been done to record this and celebrate the careers of émigré and refugees, photographers, artists, and musicians. However, not all were so fortunate to escape. It's worth taking a moment to look briefly at Salomon's work. Salomon was a pioneer of the candid camera, the now household phrase, but it was in fact first coined about his work in the Graphic magazine in 1929. His work was renowned for its intimacy, frequenting the diplomatic halls, the League of Nations in Geneva of Locarno as the storm clouds were gathering over Europe. These are amongst his most famous photographs. Salomon was renowned for his music photos, often placing himself in the midst of the orchestra using a tripod, as you can see here in this photo of young Yehudi Menuhin in The Hague. It was remarked by Queen of the Netherlands after being present at a concert, "I wondered what instrument you were playing." Although Salomon enjoyed an international career throughout the 1930s and had left Germany already in 1933, he declined the invitation to work for the Life magazine in America. Had he done so, he would have become as renowned as Alfred Eisenstadt, according to his son. Working in Holland, he was caught after the 1940 invasion, and despite going into hiding, tragically, he was deported with his wife and another son from Westerbork to Theresienstadt, and all three were murdered in Auschwitz in July 1944, aged 58. From Salomon, Auerbach learned to use available light. On arrival, we're back with Auerbach, and in the war years, opportunities for music events were naturally scarce, but he did manage to photograph Sir Henry Wood, his first music photo that he took in London, and Myra Hess at one of her fabled National Gallery concerts. This is just a brief example by diversion of two of the photos he took during those war years for Illustrated magazine, and also during the Czech work for the Czech government. And then once we start the post-war years, he was engaged as a staff photographer after finishing with the Czech government in exile. As I mentioned, he started to work for Illustrated magazine, and he started then to develop his musical opportunities. We might say these years in London, in England, were one of renewal and rehabilitation. Glyndebourne restarted, as we can see here. There's a photo from 1945 of Karl Ilbert and Rudolf Bing, and the opera goers going to the festival a decade later. One of the most important events of the post-war years was the Strauss Festival, held on the invitation of the initiative of Sir Thomas Beecham and Ernest Roth in October 1947, where the 83-year-old composer was invited to London, against opposition, one might add. Czech-born Roth was working for Boosey & Hawkes, later becoming its director, acquiring the rights to Strauss's works for Boosey in 1943. Roth had come to England in 1938. He was interned on the Isle of Man and released through the efforts of Vaughan Williams. Strauss's look here of a wistful melancholy, hearing his works performed again, evokes his late masterpieces Metamorphosen and Four Last Songs, which he would complete the following year and Boosey published in 1950. Strauss's presence was rapturously received and remarked, and the composer's royalties and Swiss bank accounts had been impounded by the Allies, and he was in an impoverished state. He was given permission to take out by the Treasury his fees, but just what was earned from the London visit. And he remarked on his financial situation, "It is destiny, who knows? Schubert and Mozart might have lived longer if they had more money." This is one of the photos that Auerbach was most proud of Paul Tourtellier. Remained a favorite of his. It was taken for Illustrated magazine. So with the post-war years, there was a formation of 2 new orchestras as well. There's a Philharmonia, which was on the initiative of Walter Legge, and not to be outdone, Sir Thomas Beecham started the Royal Philharmonic a year later in 1946. But most importantly, the era was the one for the growth of the recording industry. Auerbach then grew. He grew to love London. It afforded him many opportunities in what he termed it the 5 orchestra metropolis. Here we have the Proms, 1949, and he worked then for his career for the next 30 years, not being afraid of working in color as well. Here we have Proms in 1966. So to return to the recordings, talk for a moment about the recording studio. So the Philharmonia Orchestra had been started on the initiative of Walter Legge in 1945, and come the late 50s, there was Auerbach was able to witness a sequence of landmark opera recordings that became benchmarks of their time. Here we have Capriccio, produced by Legge. This is in the playback room. Quite shockingly, there's an immense amount of smoking going on. But because of his friendship gained with Legge, he gained not only personal access to the recording studios, but he was invited behind the scenes to soirees at Schwarzkopf, who was Walter Legge's wife, to their Hampstead home, when one's wishes one could eavesdrop on the conversations. And these intimate and candid photos show very much the influence of Solomon from the interwar years, but obviously using the better equipment. So in the recording studio, he was witness to recordings by Callas, beautifully dressed here in her furs. The young Joan Sutherland in a recording of Don Giovanni, conducted by Giulini, and Giancarlo Menotti in the console, where they're all singing along in the playback room. Most importantly, the formation of the Philharmonia Orchestra offered the rehabilitation of Otto Klemperer, who had suffered illness, but made an immensely popular comeback to London in the late 50s. Here they're recording the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. We have Wilhelm Pitts, who was the concertmaster brought over from Germany. I think he was at Bayreuth to work with the Philharmonia Orchestra. And Auerbach lived in St. John's Wood and became friends with an intimacy of people in the vicinity. Here we have the pianist Solomon and Mojsesevich playing at home. Solomon had retired by then. He'd had a stroke and he'd taken up to play the cello as physiotherapy. But you can see he's one arm is beside his leg. It's been paralyzed. And quite controversially, maybe nowadays, there was the chance for Herbert Karajan to take up a post. Interestingly, I read in the news this week that there's been a report in Salzburg about taking away names of streets, one of which is the Platz Karajan. Karajan had gone through the so-called denazification at this point, but did relaunch his career in London with the Philharmonia. We have here in the vicinity of St. John's Wood, we have the Maida Vale Studios with Igor Stravinsky and his protege, Robert Kraft, in 1958. Carl Böhm conducting, again, the Philharmonia in a recording of Così fan tutte. And again in the behind the scenes. He was also a performance photographer, but quite few and far between. Here we have Rosenkavalier, which was launched George Shorty's career in 1959 at the Opera House. And just to pause for a moment, this is an example of one of Auerbach's classic prints, where he did actually do his own printing, and he would sign the prints in the corner. And he was very, very meticulous about his own cropping. So here we have Rosenkavalier. And we have a performance of, he was invited the following year after the College of Recording to Salzburg Festival the following year, but he didn't really specialize very much in performance shots of this type. He preferred the orchestral scene. This wonderful photo of Lotte Lehmann giving a masterclass at the Wigmore Hall. I believe Dame Janet Baker was also present at that same session in 1959. And these wonderful intimate portraits rehearsing at home, too, with Gerald Moore, of the younger generation of singers who were coming to London to perform and record. And this wonderful photo, which is called The Wagnerians at Cards. He was witness to quite a few important landmark events. This is the first of the Leeds International Piano Competitions in 1963, where Hans Keller was one of the judges. And important collaborations in the West, where Shostakovich visited in 1960 for the premiere of his cello concerto, which led to the beginning of a friendship between Rostropovich and Benjamin Britten. Rostropovich hadn't actually heard of Britten before he arrived in the UK, and he went on to compose for the cellist some of his most important works. The Slava later wrote, "My dear Ben, write for the cello everything your heart tells you. Never mind how difficult it is. My love for you will help me to master every note, even the most difficult ones." We have Michael Tippett in the premiere of one of his I think, third symphony with Adrian Bolt, which didn't go much according to plan. But Vaughan Williams was present at that important event. And another photo of the same. And a meeting of three composers, the two composers and Peter Pears at Michael Tippett's 60th birthday. Auerbach was most fond of conductors, and the post-war years were a time of a lot of European-born conductors came up to take posts as music director of the leading London orchestras. Rafael Kubilik was the second music director after Karl Rankel at the Royal Opera House. We have Thomas Beecham here. And George Schulte, as I mentioned, took up the music post after at the Opera House and settled in London, unlike others which were visiting conductors, Anton Dorati, Giulini, and the revered Otto Klemperer. And it's often overlooked that because of his fame in the popular fame in the 1970s, that actually Andrei Previn was actually German-born, and he'd actually gone to left already early to Los Angeles in 1938. He was excluded from his music studies in Berlin already in 1938. Again, we have this intimacy, which is really how Auerbach's hallmark, working behind the scenes, capturing the unguarded moments, and he developed a lot of friendships. This is a photo which actually compares very favorably to one of Lotte Meitner-Graf, which we saw earlier, one of his most famous shots, and of course the important musical performances, which were in London at the time. London was famed for. Here we have Menuhin tutoring the young Nigel Kennedy. Auerbach was regrettably only took photos of the Amadeus Quartet once. He said he couldn't manage to track them down because they were so often touring abroad. And so we have Peter Schidloff, the Amadeus, in 1967. And just to pause at this moment, one of the people he regrets he never took photos of was Toscanini on a visit to England. And strangely enough, although they were habiting the same milieu, he never actually has any photos of Walter Goehr, although he was importantly recording in the recording studio with the BBC and the Philharmonia at the same time. But he had a lifelong friendship with some of these composers, some of these musicians, composers. Erich Auerbach here is in Zermatt, with Maria and Pablo Casals at music class, famous pianists. Here's one of Alexander Goehr, for obvious reasons. And next is a quite wonderful portrait of Ashkenazi, which was in the summer where he'd actually defected and decided to take up residence in England. I think he was 27 at the time. Jacqueline Duque, Stephen Bishop. As she's 80 this year, I decided to show a photo of Martha Argerich, the young Martha Argerich. He was, Auerbach, as he said, developed friendship with these musicians, and also invited to their hotel rooms and backstage while they were preparing performances. Here we have the wonderful Czechoslovakian pianist, Zuzana Rushikova, and Annie Fischer. Stravinsky is someone who's going to pop up throughout the course of this evening. And one of the most famous encounters was during a visit when Rostropovich knew he was going to be in the UK at the same time as Stravinsky, telephoned Auerbach asking him to bring some photos of the composer for him to sign and take back with him to the USSR. This actually meeting took place at the Royal College of Music. These are just two of my favorites, Leonard Bernstein and Benny Goodman's, which just show the sheer exuberance. And I think it's because of this affinity that Auerbach had for music that he was able to capture such memorable pictures. And his legacy really is that although the archive was privately owned and it was a very much a niche thing, by depositing it with the Getty archive, it was able to be preserved for posterity. And it's much reproduced today in magazine covers and CD covers. And most famously, if you scroll back, just pause a minute. There was at the auction in Sotheby's in 2018. The photo was used as a backdrop for his cellos. There's just a few stray photos at the end, just to compare with what we've seen by the other photographers this evening, because their names mentioned by Norbert. Sorry, Norbert.
Forgive me, I think there was a blank page and I assumed it was.
Yeah, I know that's because I have to move on. I pushed them to the end, just as a postscript. There's a few things to compare.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is it there, or you've closed it? Never mind.
Oh, sorry. No, I've actually now I found it, but I have not shared the screen yet. I think if you don't mind, Leon, I think we should
sure
move on. But thank you so much. Now, I hope that everybody is okay with staying on. I know this is very much material, and I do really know that it's quite a long event. But I think we should definitely give Julia, the time she wants to present what she's prepared. And so, Julia, we're all ears, and we look forward to hearing from you now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to share screen. There we go, straight into it. Just want to say that, hello to everyone. And if my internet becomes unstable, someone will tell me. It's not brilliant here, so I might turn off my video, which I'd be very happy to do. Anyway, before I start this talk, I just want to thank my sister Lydia, who's really helped me with this project, and I should credit her for some of the ideas that I'm going to discuss tonight. So I'm going to give just a quick resume of Laelia's life, as the detail can be seen on previous Inside Outsiders talks and also on my website, laeliagoehr.com. Actually, before I do this, I need to go into, there we are, right, I'm fine, now I'm sorted, thank you. So I'll just focus on her life. She, very briefly, she's born in Kiev in 1908, and from an early age, she studied the piano to a high level at the conservatory in Kiev. At her first public concert, the pianist Vladimir Horowitz, a few years older than her, was giving his final performance at the school, and he became one of her favorite pianists. She said in an interview given to the Ham and High Gazette in 1987, "I listened to Horowitz, he is my favorite pianist, and I decided that if I could not play a quarter as well as him, I'd stop playing, so I did stop. However, after leaving Kiev due to the consequences of the Russian Revolution and moving to Berlin at the age of 13, she continued her musical education seriously at the academy, the Hochschule for Music, studying with the famous piano teacher Leonid Kreutzer, initially on an informal basis, since she was too young to meet the age requirement for matriculation. At 16, she enrolled as a full-time student, graduating in 1929. So as Norbert said a while ago, she did have a professional career, but not in the classical world. She and her best friend, Rosa Goldenstein, this lady on the right, was known as Peggy, and they formed a piano duo called the Stone Sisters in 1928. For the next 2 years, they traveled around Germany, Switzerland, the Baltic countries, playing and singing American popular song, ragtime, and well-known German cabaret songs in cinemas, stage shows, and concerts. By 1930, Laelia had married my grandfather, the conductor Walter Goehr, and by 1933, they'd moved to London with their baby son, Alexander. This is when professional photography came into play, shadowing Bill Brandt in the 40s and having an extremely successful career until the 1970s. Laelia photographed a wide range of subjects, but it's her musicians I'm focusing on tonight. So in the last year, through the pandemic, Lydia and I have both been working on archiving a large collection of family photographs we have dating back to the late 18th century, I think. In this archive, which Lydia has in New York, there's Laelia's Berlin album, which is full of photographs of her music teachers, friends, acquaintances, and fellow students. It's certainly a normal photograph album that so many people would have made at that time, but it also shows that even at the age of 19, when she was having a full and busy life in the Weimar Berlin, she was collecting and collating photographs into book form, and of course recording her own life. So I'm just going to show a couple. So we know this cellist is really in 1927, and the composer Robert Kahn, with a personal message to Laelia. Her maiden name was Rivlin. This is the Hochschule, excuse my German, the academy. And this is her professor, Leonid Kreutzer, down here, and I'm presuming that's him sailing away somewhere, and that's him again. And I don't know who these two, but like everyone else, I thought they were terrific photographs, so I put them in. Personal choice. I'm going to look at the way she worked and let her speak for herself through her photographs and through some of the through some of her words about her shoots. It seems that she was always on stage and close to the musicians. She first started taking photos of musicians in 1965 when Stravinsky came to London for his last visit. She tells the Ham and High in an article at the time of the publication of her book, Musicians in Camera, in 1987, that in her own words, but without her strong Russian accent, which I have no intention of impersonating, she had to stand behind the percussionists. She said, "I was not allowed a tripod, flash on any extra lighting, and the lighting was appalling." She also noted that Stravinsky was the musician of the century, just as Picasso was in art, and perhaps James Joyce in literature. The presentation, I'm going to now show some photographs of Stravinsky she took, and they're really influenced by her own mock-up books that she made which are in my possession, opposed to sort of the curated examples like in her pamphlet Stravinsky, Rehearsed Stravinsky. So these photographs are of her, of Stravinsky. She was not a photographer with vast amounts of equipment. She used a 35mm Pentax camera with telephoto lens mounted on a very small handheld tripod and had a number of other lenses. This is what she told the Ham and High. At rehearsals, I put the tripod on my chest and just focus on the conductor throughout, on the facial expressions which the audience never sees. And by the second half of the rehearsal, I feel I've known that man for 100 years. It says in the same article that the musicians never saw the finished photographs of themselves. Why should I, she says. There are photographers who run after musicians and impose themselves. I just took the photographs and went away. She, like many photographers of the time, shot in black and white and developed and edited her films in a little dark room next to her flat in Hampstead Heath. She had a marvelous eye for editing, and for many of musicians she took, she created sets of photographs. She didn't do too many formal portraits, as she didn't have a studio. My sense is that she just shadowed the musicians, snapping away, to use her own words. Menuhin, in his foreword for her book, Musicians in Camera, discusses the art of photographing musicians. He asks, how do you manage to freeze and arrest the moment while at the same time conveying to those who look at your photography that the moment is not frozen or arrested, but flows onwards? That for me is the test of an exceptional photographer. He goes on to say that there are answers to his questions in these photos of musicians. He continues, seldom have I seen images which flow with the music and musicians in quite such harmony. Laelia Goehr possesses the sensitivity to show us as we are and were, and with many of these unforgettable artists will continue to be. If there is one thing that I can say about these photographs, which so move me, is their recognition of the curious, never-ending delight in the unobtainable and the sheer joy of sometimes approaching it. In music, fleeting, effervescent and fugitive as it is, there's a real achievement to which one is deeply grateful. I think that Laelia catches the movement in her single photographs, but you get so much more when you see the sets, which is how I've chosen to show them this evening. You can see so much movement and expression. Sometimes the photographs are a bit out of focus, very easy to do when the lighting is bad and the subject's moving around all the time, but they still give a moving and, more importantly, musical impression of the artist. One comment Menuhin did make in his foreword, which I would disagree with, and I know my father would as well, is that Laelia, being the mother of a composer, and I suppose the wife of a conductor, is what gave her an understanding of musical life. And this is wrong. From an early age, she had a deep understanding of what it was to be a musician, a performer, and always had deep emotional engagement with music. And that is reflected in these pictures, independently of her close family. As I mentioned earlier, oh gosh, I've realized I've come to the end. As I mentioned earlier, she made many books and sets of her photographs. She experimented with lots of ideas and formats for presentations. Because there are so many musicians represented in her book, Musicians in Camera, over 77, one gets a glimpse of how she thought, but not the full experience. So that the sequences that I'm about to show you are basically longer. And I've come to the end of my talk. So I'm now just going to let her speak for herself in her photos. And I'm going to show you a series of sets of photos. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Julia. Now, thank you very much, everybody, for your patience. I mean, I can only say from my point of view, the time has gone so quickly just watching these fascinating images. And I would like to pass on to Monica now, who will who will look at a brief sequence of questions. I know already that I want to follow a few things up with tonight's presenters individually later on, but it will take too long tonight. So let's give ourselves a few minutes for questions, and then hopefully we will go to our Sunday evening dinners and move on, and hopefully we'll pick this up at another time. But Monica, over to you.
Yes, well, thank everybody so very much. That was totally fascinating with lots of interesting overlaps. There actually aren't that many questions, so I would urge anybody who does want to ask something, now is your chance. There's one useful comment from Jona Jepu-Kromholz in Jerusalem, I think, about rhythmic gymnastics. This is for you, I think, Amanda, was still taught or recently was at the Cleveland Institute of Music as the Dalcroze method. So that's a useful.
Thank you. It's good to know.
A question about Erich Auerbach's archive. Is this entirely at Getty, Leon, or is there somewhere else one might turn?
It is entirely at Getty. But what happens is that only a proportion is available online, because only a proportion gets digitized. But there's a much deeper archive with contact prints and individual frames in the archive there.
We have to make do with those annoying watermarks. So yes, anyway, otherwise wonderful reproductions. Fine, I think Lydia, Julia's sister, has a comment. Lydia, do you go ahead? You want to actually unmute yourself? Go on.
I have, yes. I just wanted to add something to what my sister said, which is that Laelia's album she took in Berlin is actually a sequence of photographs of all the members of the Hochschule in 1927 to 1928. And we found an edition of the catalogue for that year with all the musicians. So we're trying to line up the musicians with the names to find out what happened to these musicians. I suspect many died during the war. But after that, Julia will put that together as part of I hope. I can't do it, so I hope my sister will be doing it.
Wonderful.
But it's an amazing coincidence of documents that we have.
We look forward to seeing the results. No, but I wonder if I might ask a question, perhaps particularly to you, something you mentioned right at the very beginning, that there's this sort of rather odd discrepancy, or sort of, yes, oddity, in that, you know, you have these very talented émigré photographers and you have a whole roster of very talented musicians and composers, and yet the photographers were not, for the most part, taking pictures of those musical individuals. How do you, you know, make sense of that?
Well, I mean, I think it is to be explained. I think the only out of their, you know, what was in the public focus at the time. So, I mean, while, you know, we've seen such wonderful intimate photographs of musicians at work, you know, I think that now this is so overwhelmingly specific, these encounters that we've seen on these photographs, that I don't even in my mind now want to separate the émigrés who, you know, I mean, there were so many individual stories, you know, among all these people, that some people were indeed, you know, forced to emigrate, and some people lost, you know, many members of their families in the Holocaust. And others chose to move. Others were headhunted, you know, and actually took work opportunities. People such as, you know, Karl Ebert or Fritz Busch were, you know, long before they even came to Britain, they were internationally connected and they were looking for opportunities to further their careers. And that didn't fundamentally change during the war even. So, you know, I think for me, it's now more difficult to actually differentiate in my mind who I would count into this, you know, world of the émigrés that maybe we've been championing within the Insiders Outsiders Festival. You know, people in many disciplines. Of course, music has only played a small part in that. So, you know, again, if we look at the sheer mobility that is evident in those stories, in those moments that we've seen witnessed, that are somehow preserved here, and also, of course, the moments in the encounter between the photographer and the subject, again, which, you know, made me think a lot now about, you know, knowing more about the individual behind the camera as well. So, you know, I would say that, you know, the photographers here were émigré musicians. There were people with a particular sensitivity towards the qualities here, the values that are represented in many of those images, and in their devotion to music. So I don't know if that made much sense, but that's my response to this, because I think that sort of initial categorization that I may also have fallen victim to, it really does not hold up when you look at the reality of what we've seen tonight.
Good. Now, I think probably time to start drawing things to a close. So last chance to ask any questions. Or Norbert, I don't know if you want to round things off yourself.
Well, I just want to say that, you know, I've been really inspired by these three presentations, and the photographs there, you know, I think are wonderful works of art in themselves and really deserve to be seen more. And I just want to say that I hope that we can work together in the next years to perhaps find opportunities also for some of these photographs to feature in our work and what we are presenting within the Music, Migration and Mobility project. But otherwise, I mean, I'm really overjoyed that there has been you know, a lot of interest in this, and that, you know, people have stayed with us for quite a long time. And so I'm very happy to catch the last bit of the evening sun now in London, and I would urge you to do the same. But I want to say thank you again, you know, from my personal point of view here, to being asked to be part of this, and for you know, being able to listen to your presentations and see those wonderful images, which I hope we will see a lot more of.
Wonderful. Well, I'd just like to add my own very heartfelt thanks to all of you, and indeed to the audience as well. Just also to remind you that the event has been recorded, and the recording will be uploaded probably within the week onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. So tell other people about it. You might like to revisit it and, you know, kind of think again about some of the wonderful images we've been encountering today. Also, just apropos Picture Post, just sort of en passant, but actually also relevant, there's a new film about Picture Post by Rob West and Amanda, I think I'm right, aren't I, that you feature in it. I mean, Picture Post is such a rich subject, you know, in its own right, but of course employed so many interesting photographers, many of them émigrés like Laurent himself. And I'm in contact with Rob West, the director, in the hope that we might organise an online screening of that. So that's something, an event for the future, which will be advertised if it happens on the Insiders Outsiders website. And there are more events this week, as you may know, is in fact Refugee Week across the UK. And to mark that, we have another week of online events on different subjects, but photography tends to be, you know, it's an ongoing interest of mine for reasons to do with my mother. Some of you may know my mother's work, Dorothy Bohm, who came as a child to this country, different story again. But yes, do take a look in the What's On section of the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website if you're curious to know what's in store, and indeed sign up to the newsletter if you'd like to be kept informed. So good night. As Norbert says, I think it's time to enjoy the balmy evening. All the very best and goodbye. Many thanks.